May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight. Amen. For the first time in years, I have a TV apartment. And this TV holds a prominent place in the center of the living room. At any time of the day, there's a good chance that at least one of my 3 apartment mates is watching it. We eat in the living room, we hang out in the living room. So over the past couple months, I've had a good amount of time around the television set. And do I feel flooded with distressing information? On CNN, 24/7 coverage of an election that brings me great anxiety. You turn on MSNBC and there's news of another unarmed black man who's been murdered by the police. If I want to, let's say, the Disney Channel, not the Disney Channel, the Discovery Channel. We'll get to Disney later. There is still a good chance that there will be a special about global warming. Whenever we click on the television, it feels like there is a tidal wave of information approaching. And it is very easy to feel powerless. This morning we have been invited to sit down with the disciples, hear Jesus' response to the distressing issues of the first century. To the parable of the widow and the judge, Jesus tells the disciples what to expect when he is physically left them. He says that it will be as easy to feel powerless as it did in the times before Noah and the ark. Despite the pervasive injustice, people will be eating and drinking, planting and building, buying and selling and carrying on as if nothing is amiss. This is the world that the disciples will have to navigate. But how do we not lose heart in times like these? The parable this morning is the answer to this question. Jesus doesn't respond with a commandment or a formula, but he tells them a story. He tells them a parable, which is always a play on conventional wisdom. Disguised as a pithy piece of advice, parables guide the listener to the kingdom of God through recognizable characters and settings. John Dominic Crossan describes parables in this way. Myth establishes the world. Narrative explores the world. Proverbs defend the world. Satire teases the world. But parables subvert the world. And who does Jesus choose to turn the world upside down in this morning's parable? Jesus, the great Jewish teacher, lifts up the widow, along with the orphan, would have been known to the disciples' special connection with God. They would have recognized the parable's relationship to the book of Isaiah, which says, "Learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the orphan, and plead for the widow." However, in this parable, it is the widow who is pleading for herself. The parable says that in a certain city, a widow stands up to a corrupt judge or fight for justice. She does not just speak up, she wears this judge out. The judge has no respect for God or for anyone else, eventually gives into her demands. The parable ends with the assurance that God will aid those that call out to her day and night. While the book of Isaiah teaches that special care must be given to the orphan because they have no one to defend them, in this parable's vision of the kingdom, it is the widow who finds her own voice, and it is the widow who defends herself. This parable takes a seemingly powerless person in a seemingly hopeless situation and makes her the model of agency and perseverance. The power behind this particular woman in this particular time points to a much deeper meaning within the parable than its common interpretation of the squeaky wheel is the one that gets the grease. And the author of the Gospel of Luke does something that is almost unprecedented. He wants to steer us away from the easy interpretation that this is some simplistic advice. So he says the meaning of the parable before it even begins. It is framed with the words, "Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not lose heart." Yes, the widow is speaking up. But what is the power? What is the drive? What is the inspiration behind her voice and behind her resilience? What is her secret that enables her to bravely face a dire situation again and again? What allows her to transcend the rules and the expectations of her society? Jesus opens by saying that the first need that the parable addresses is the need for us to pray always. I've been wrestling with what this praying always means here. There goes my candle. And I think the parable has something to do with staying in constant dialogue with the divine. I've read mystics who talk about our need to pray without ceasing. So I've tried saying mantras as I'm on the subway in New York. I've tried lifting up my grievances to God when I feel especially frustrated when I'm cut off in traffic or annoyed at the grocery store. But I quickly fall out of this practice and I fall out of this habit. It's very hard to stay in this constant dialogue. So some of us, we need a companion. We need a guide that walks with us and continues our conversation on the deeper matters of existence. The movies talk about this companion. As we know in The Lion King, it's not just Simba, but Simba has Rafiki. Where would Simba be if it wasn't for Rafiki? Would Simba be able to let go of the past? Would Simba be able to fight Scar and all of the corrupt rulers of the Pride Lands without Rafiki? I don't think so. And what would Luke be without Yoda? Where would the Jedi be without? We don't need just cartoons and fantasies to know the importance of our spiritual companions. As we heard this morning, Nelson Mandela was able to fight for freedom in South Africa, but he didn't do it alone. He did it with a visionary named Bishop Desmond Tutu, who came alongside spiritual guidance and brave action all along together. But still, it doesn't need to be person. We can also stay in dialogue with our inner teacher, our inner Rafiki, or prayer to me is not limited to pleading with God for what we want, but it is about facing the pain that I've been denying in order to this current moment and what it is inviting. Palmer talks about finding a space where we can listen to our lives. Whatever practice or place allows us to do that, I call it prayer, but you all can call it any label that you want. Either way, meditation and prayer is a powerful way for me to draw inspiration into how to live into the present, no matter how dire the situation may be. When we listen to our we often are nudged into unexpected new adventures, identities, and ways of being in the world. This path of praying always and finding your particular voice in this particular time is at the very root of the way, a term that the early followers of Jesus used for the early Christ movement. Within these early communities, there was no one right way to be a spiritual person or to fight for justice. I love that this parable, by the way, invites us to do both. The Apostle Paul told the early Christians in Corinth that the same Spirit manifested in a variety of gifts among them, and it would lead to different expressions. He compared them to one body with many members. The foot is different from the hand, and the hand is different from the eye, but that we are all in need of one another, and all parts of the body are dependent on one another. After Eric Garner was murdered and the Black Lives Matter movement in New York City, it became very clear that there were many ways to get involved. I was at Union Theological Seminary at the time, and at the very beginning it seemed like every single person was going to every single protest, and the burnout rate was very high. Very, very high. As it dragged on and on, it became clear that there were many ways for us to get involved in the struggle for justice. For those that were out in the streets protesting, they needed someone to look after their kids. For those who had been traumatized by just living in the world today, they needed somebody to speak to them, to hold space so they could process it. We all needed food. When there was the expectation that everyone would be everywhere, there was great burnout. But when we listened to our lives and when we listened to each other, we began to realize that the way that our unique gifts could contribute to the community in a collective fight for justice. Parker Palmer, in his 5 Habits of the Heart, names finding our voice, or finding our way to share our as the source of new life. He says that many of us have been socialized to feel like we can only be spectators in the realms of politics, religion, and education. This causes us to lack confidence and to feel powerless. Our voices and our actions will change during each season of our life, but the task is to find alignment with the needs of this moment and take the risk of contributing to positive change. When we can find our expression of the Spirit, the new life that it brings helps us to live into the second aim of the parable, to not lose heart. The widow in the parable is not unlike the widows and the mothers in Argentina who for 30 years continued a weekly march to the Plaza de Mayo in the heart of Buenos Aires. Every Thursday they gathered to demand an investigation into the disappearance of their sons and their husbands during the military regimes of the 1970s. They succeeded in discovering the fates of over 1/3 of these husbands and sons. But in order for the famous march to happen, which was both a pilgrimage and a protest, there were many unseen supporters. Not everybody was on the front line. Some people were lighting candles and saying prayers. Others were making sure that the business was taken care of at home. The bond between spirituality and justice that the widow represented is still being lived out today all over the world. And each of us in this community of First Congregational Church holds tremendous power because each of us have an expression of the Spirit within us. As the Apostle Paul said, now there are a variety of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are a variety of services, but the same Lord. And there are a variety of activities, but the same God who activates all of them in every one. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. So, week ahead, when the wave of distress is approaching, take a breath and remember the widow. In her story, we learn that when we feel the most powerless, it is the perfect time to reconnect with God. Take the risk, get involved, and share the gift that is within you, knowing that there is not one right way to be a lover of justice or a spiritual person. There are many of us all over the world who are trying to use our spirit for the common good. And this is good news. Amen.